Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first webinar in our Exploring Bioregionalism series. My name is Michelle Maloney, and in a moment I'll give an introduction to our webinar series and tell you all about our wonderful guest speaker. But first, if all goes well, I'm going to press some buttons and bring up the appropriate bits and pieces. Okay. So thank you so much to everyone who can join us today live or is watching this recording. We're really pleased that you can be with us. As I mentioned, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is really pleased to be kicking off a new webinar series to stimulate conversations and share information about bioregionalism. So in our first webinar today, and we're hoping to have them every month or so for the next year or two, today, in a moment, I'll be inviting Shrishtee Bajpai to introduce herself and share some of her amazing work with you. But before I do that, for those who are new to AELA, what I'd like to do is actually spend 10 minutes with an introduction to our organisation, AELA, and why we're interested in bioregionalism. And I'll talk very briefly about the Greenprints framework, which is something we created to hopefully make it more accessible for some folks to start connecting with Earth-centred governance and bioregionalism. Then we'll hand over to Shrishtee, who will chat with us for 30 or 40 minutes. And because we have a nice, generous session today, we'll still have time for questions and discussion. So for everyone in the live audience, as you have questions, please write them into the chat. We'll collect them and flag them all in the final session when we have a bit of a discussion. Before I do an acknowledgement of country, I want to do a quick plug for one of our next webinars. We're actually lining up our August one, but the October one is locked in with the always wonderful Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, a dear friend and very important colleague and advisor to the work that AELA does. And in that session, we'll be exploring Western science and what Western science tells us about bioregions, boundaries, and other interesting things. But first, I would like to acknowledge country. And for anyone who's in our audience today who's not from Australia, in many countries, I know this is a practice, but in Australia, thankfully, it's becoming more and more of a practice for non-Indigenous people like myself to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional lands of First Nations peoples. I live, work, and play a little bit north of Brisbane, which is actually the beautiful traditional lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people. And where I live, it also connects up with Jinnabara traditional lands. So I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge the first peoples of these lands and acknowledge that land was never ceded in treaty or in any other way. We live on stolen lands in Australia, and it's a very important obligation on all of us in the non-Indigenous communities to not just acknowledge country, but where possible work in solidarity with Indigenous colleagues and friends to really tell the truth about this country and its history and its place and to build a future together. And for those who know my work, I'm really proud to be part of a group called Future Dreaming Australia with Indigenous friends and colleagues, including Mary Graham and Ross Williams. And that's a really important part of my personal commitment to decolonising my knowledge, my work, and the future of governance in Australia. So for those who are in Australia or somewhere else in the world, do feel free to pop in the chat whose country you're on today or whose land you're on, where you are, maybe even mention a plant or an animal that you might have seen in your local place. It's always delightful to see your comments and to connect with you in these small, humble ways online and to know what you're up to. Okay, so what I'd like to do is spend about 10 minutes just explaining a little bit about AELA, because we know a lot of folks who've registered for this webinar are from other parts of the world, and to tell you why we're interested in bioregionalism. And then I'll be really delighted to hand over to Shrishtee to talk a whole lot more about the work that they're doing, both in the Global Tapestry for Alternatives and in her other work as well. AELA, or the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, is my primary organisation for doing the kinds of earth-centred work that I'm interested in. We're a very small, not-for-profit organisation. We work to increase the understanding and practical implementation of earth-centred governance. And to put that into simple concepts, really what we're asking is, how can we make positive change to current governance systems to create an ecologically healthy and socially just society, one that cares for all the plants and animals and creatures as well as all the people? When we talk about governance, we like to break that down to the simplest explanation that we use, which is we see governance as the sexy stuff. It really is that which lies beneath all of our cultures and societies. These are the rules we make to live, work, and play together. And we're interested in the rules that we make to live, work, and play together at every scale of human activity. And we always like to mention that although sometimes AELA focuses on laws, the laws and the rules that create the big systems, also governance is about the moral codes and social norms within a society. And all of those are created in turn by the culture and the values and the beliefs of the people. So throughout humanity's history and prehistory, human beings have organised themselves. And as many of you know, what we're interested in is how modern Western societies in particular, but modern capitalist societies generally, are really focused on a human-centred, extractivist, growth-focused mode of being. And so groups like ourselves and other wonderful humans like Shrishtee and all of her groups are interested in how we shift to a system that reclaims our position within a wider global society of plants and animals, as well as just people. In AELA's work, we're inspired by Western concepts like earth jurisprudence, but we're also really passionate about, as we live on this continent, in this continent, with this continent, connecting with the First Peoples' knowledge and sharings in Australia. So the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, our work is multidisciplinary, and if you're interested, our website outlines this framework of what we're interested in: changing culture, connecting governance with that which matters, love of earth, understanding how places work, building community, creating alternatives. In our work, and that's our cute little AELA ecocentric toolkit, although we're small, we have wonderful networks and amazing people that we work with. And a lot of our work is about education, culture change, and showing alternatives. And we know that the work we do, many of the seeds we're planting in our lifetime may not come to a massive social change in this moment, but we know that they will be changing, or contributing to the change we need. So that's a little bit about AELA. Why are we interested in bioregionalism? Well, some have referred to bioregionalism as localisation within the foundations of nature, but there are much deeper definitions of bioregionalism, and we'll be exploring them throughout this series. And I know that Shrishtee hopefully will refer to some of the publications and other work that she's been doing that connects to an understanding of what bioregionalism is all about. There's a lot of literature on the origins of the concept in Western societies, which much of it originated in the US through Cascadia in the 1970s, where people were saying, wouldn't it make a lot more sense if we organised ourselves the way many First Peoples did along natural systems, catchments, rivers, boundaries that actually explained who we were and enabled us to connect to places and understand how we live in some kind of harmony with the natural systems that support us. So in AELA, we actually believe that bioregionalism, or there's literature now saying that bioregioning is the new term, but we think it's not just a manageable way to think about earth-centered governance, but it's a powerful and important way for the reality of most human beings is that their local places is the critical space that they live, work, and play within. And many of us in the West are disconnected from our local natural systems. We don't know the creeks, the rivers, the undulation of the land, the types of soils, or even many of the creatures that we share this place with. And a greater understanding of these things in our bioregions should, if we allow it, inform a much more successful and long-term society. That's our hope anyway. I won't talk for much longer, but I just want to share for about a minute the initiative that's hosting these webinar series and a body of work that AELA is involved in, which is called Greenprints. Our website is just actually going through a bit of a makeover. If you do visit it, you'll get a good overview of what we're up to in Greenprints, but do be aware a number of the website pages haven't been completely updated. I won't go through that slide, but you can read it on our site. Greenprints is although it looks like we've created a nice, Western style, here are the steps you take to success, what we've created are stepping stones through the often complex and messy world of trying to understand how we take systems that we live in today that are in overshoot, that are complex, that are often eating up more of the natural systems than we can possibly hope to understand, and actually make it understandable. So Greenprints is a framework for earth-centered thinking and action. And we really focus on a shift in worldview. Instead of the Western concept of do whatever you like and fix up the damage later, let's focus on the economy and fix up the damage if we want to. This is all about helping Westerners in particular think differently, think about local places, understand this connection that we have, and build our societies out of a healthy relationship with nature, not just an abstract concept of resource management, so that all of the unique places across Australia and across the world become and return to what was very much and is the governance system in many societies, a much more sympathetic, land-based understanding of where we fit in and that we're just one member of the Earth community. So Greenprints is both some simple stepping stones, sitting on top of a very deep analysis of the kinds of tools that unfortunately we need in the complexity of Western market-based systems that need significant change. And I just want to mention that on the website, there's a little story about some of the very early steps that we took in a project with a community in Lithgow, where we looked at ecological foundations and what their transition for their community could look like if that focused on building the healthy relationship with living world, not just designing new economic silver bullets and industries that may or may not be compatible with place. And to flag with you, we're very excited because a number of communities are coming together down in the South Coast catchment, or what Aussies would call the Gold Coast, but it's a whole lot more than just that strip of buildings on the beach. And that's actually going to be our next multi-year project, engaging with all of the wonderful people who are doing terrific work and using a bioregional approach to thinking about land care, caring for biodiversity, rethinking the economy, and also digging deeply into our own governance systems and the way laws and rules are made in this country. So that's actually all I wanted to say, and thank you for letting me introduce our work. I'm now really delighted to introduce Shrishtee. And if folks have any questions for me or any of the work that we do in AELA, please do either shoot us an email or pop a question in the chat for discussion at the end of this webinar. Now, Shrishtee, going to hand over to Shrishtee now. I won't read her whole bio. Shrishtee and I connected through some Rights of Nature webinars and symposia and activities many years ago, and I am a huge admirer of her work. I'll just read the first couple of sentences and then I'll invite Shrishtee to tell you all about herself, however she would like to do so. So Shrishtee describes herself as a researcher activist, and her current research is focused on exploring alternatives to mainstream development models, documenting worldviews of communities, carrying out networking, and what she sees her work as an ongoing process of bringing together practitioners, thinkers, researchers, and others working on alternatives to currently dominant forms of economic development and political governance. Our work really resonates and we're very inspired by what they're up to, particularly with the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. But that is enough from me. I'm really delighted now to say hello, Shrishtee, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for having me here. And thanks to everybody who has joined today. I can see some familiar faces. Hi, Anitra. Hi, Supriya. Hi, Herman. So yeah, I'll just get into maybe the presentation itself, and I look forward to sharing it with all of you and also hearing your own work and reflections through this. I hope you can see it full screen now. Okay.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks. Um, so I wanted to share today over the next 28, 29 minutes that I have some of the experiences of what Michelle was just sharing of what governance could look like from a non-anthropocentric perspective. And What I want to highlight today is some of those examples that have existed for a long time in this world and are still being practiced by several communities across the world. I'll share mostly from the Indian context. But they have lessons for all of us to learn because there are commonalities between our struggles, our resistance, and also what we are trying to create collectively. Of course, our context varies and we change according to those, but also there's so many things that are common to our struggles. And so I want to share some of those examples. Want to also bring in some aspects around rights of nature that might be challenging these discourses, and then move towards what does systemic transformations really mean in the context that we are living in. But before I do that, I love going to the roots of some commonly used words. It just helps us ground where they come from and what do they really mean, and what do they have come to mean in the world that we're currently living in. Democracy, for example, is the rule of the people. That's where it comes from. And it has come to mean so many other things, but rule of the people. Earth derives from Germanic earthe, meaning ground. Politics comes from citizen and city. Governance comes from gouverneur, to steer and rule. Some of the words like radical, which is often used in a very negative way, comes from going to the roots and challenging the conventional. Anyway, the idea was just for us to remember the true meanings of some of these words, and also not letting them be co-opted by dominant systems, and really bringing back that meaning of what they meant. Now, why do we need to talk about the governance is something that we are talking about, but in general, why do we need to talk about self-governance? And why is it important is because for a lot of communities across the world, we are seeing now with our own connections through global networks, is that it is a way of assertion of identity and different ways of being. It is the ability to take control of one's life and have the power and agency of one's own life, and that being rested with the communities rather than with the nation states or policy makers or others from who are not from the landscape. It's also about collective power, because it's not just about one community being strengthened and the rest living in any sort of suppression or oppression. It's about building multiple such communities across the world. So it's about that collective strength and power. And a lot of these are actually rooted in relational care, justice, respect for humans, and more than humans. I'll come to some of the internal dynamics and issues as well, but that's for later. But one sees that there is this very close assertion to one's identity, one's way of being, and who we are in many of these governance systems. This quote that you see on the top in the slide is from a village in central India, not very far from where I am at the moment, where communities about 3 decades ago said that we elect government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. And what does that really mean for communities? And they have been holding this process of self governance for about 30 years now. Um, and it has its own challenges, but let's get into what does it really mean. Now, how is it practiced? Now, inspired by a lot of this movement of self governance, and it was also part of the anti imperial struggle here in India, a lot of communities have been talking about a different form of self governance. Some call it Swaraj, which Gandhi spoke about. But there are so many other versions of what does self governance really mean. So this example is again from central India, where about 2 decades ago, this community, it's the Gond Adivasis, indigenous peoples who live in this landscape, who had been protesting against mining in their sacred forest. And while they were doing this resistance movement, they realized that resistance is important, but along with that, they need to re envision what self governance would look like for their landscape. So they actually formed a federation of 90 villages which is based on their traditional boundaries, their own traditional conceptions of what their territory looked like, and which cuts across a lot of state boundaries and state district levels. But they formed this federation, and it has been working over the last 10 years now. First, to assert that we can govern ourselves. We don't need a forest department or the state institution to tell us how do we manage and control and preserve our community forest. And actually started a process of first looking over their management and sustainable practices, which they weren't laid out very clearly, but then they began the process of doing so. And self governance, which was built on traditional systems, but also questioning some of the problems of traditional systems. For example, women not having space to be part of the decision making process, certain caste not being part of decision making process. So really changing some of those and adapting to the modern discourses in some ways, and also creating processes of cultural identity and assertion. The other example that I want to share is also, again, a very powerful one, which is from the eastern part of India now, from the state of Odisha. Now, this community that you see are again indigenous peoples called the Dongriya Konds, and the hill that you see behind is the Niyam Raja. Now, they have a very similar story of a resistance against a powerful mining corporation, Vedanta, where they argued that it is not for us to decide what happens in these forests because we are following the rules set by the Niyam Raja. Now, Niyam Raja, if translated crudely in English, would be the king of rules. So it's the deity, and the deity decides what happens in this territory. And so they've been, and in 2013, this is what the argument they held and went to the court of law. The Supreme Court of India delivered a historic judgment recognizing that a deity can decide what happens in a territory, and we must acknowledge that. And they put a stop on the bauxite mining proposals that were proposed. Of course, again, all of this is going through a lot of state repression that subsequently many of these Adivasi activists have to face, um, while they challenge the state and corporations. But what I wanted to highlight here is that there is a sacred law. There is a law that is being set by the mountains and the territories. It's not set by the humans. And that law and governance is deciding what happens in that territory. Now, it's a very, very different conception to the kind of governance you and I are used to, where the more than human is actually setting the rules, whereas we are set in a very different systems. The other example that I want to share is from northeast India, quite far from the mainland India, where this landscape that you see on your screen is a territory for the Bhutia tribe that came from Bhutan and then Tibet and then finally entered to India many centuries ago. And they have a very strong worldviews of connection with nature. They have stories around rivers, they have stories of mountains. Everything is alive for these communities. And they have a very sophisticated system of self governance called the Zumsa system. Zumsa, translated in English, would mean people's assembly. And it's a democratic self-governing system actually within the Indian constitution, recognized and have a special autonomy status where people can govern themselves, and Indian state doesn't interfere or get into managing stuff unless the community themselves ask for any help. It's a consensus based decision making system. It follows the place based model of decision making. Rules are again very similar to what I was sharing earlier, are set by the guardian deities. Sorry, it says my guardian deities, so it's by guardian deities. And the conservation and protection of rivers and forests becomes a very important element of it. And so this river that you see coming through the Kanchenjunga mountains is a very important river, which about 10 years ago they decided not to put any dams on, And they said, while we were speaking to some of the activists there, they said they are following the sacred laws where the river is not allowed to be dammed. And so now actually it's criminalized there to even talk about dams in this community. Whereas in the lower downstream, several dams have come up and they're causing massive damage to these ecosystems. Again, what I'm trying to highlight here is that when people are taking decisions of what happens to these ecosystems, it's not for them to decide. It is for all of those communities, and the sense of community is so much bigger than just humans. It's about the mountains, it's about the rivers. They all form the sense of a community, which in the modern systems we have lost. And we see such systems and kind of all across the Himalayas in India. We also see it in the trans Himalayan landscape. I'm not sure if all of you are aware about, but Himalayas are relatively very new in the history or the timescape of this earth, which is 60 million years ago. Whereas trans Himalayan landscape in India, which is also connected to Tibet and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, is a landscape which existed before the Himalayas, and that makes it a very unique landscape. It was below the sea, and then when the whole, shift happened, it came out. And so this, and the river that you see flowing through there in this picture is the river Indus, and it flows through Tibet, India, and then Pakistan, and then subsequently comes in and falls into Bay of Bengal. What I want to share here is that across the Himalayas, across the trans Himalayan landscape, people have these systems of governance which are place based, and they have mechanisms of conflict resolutions, solving land and revenue issues, maintaining governance of common lands, and other, lots of important cultural social functions. And these systems, what we have been documenting over the last 3 4 years, have a very strong relevance even today. And that's what surprised us, because most of the modern India doesn't even know about, leave alone recognition and acknowledgement, doesn't even know about that these systems still exist. And people follow them, people rely on them, and they continue to do so because of the very important reason that they're responding to the place that they're living in. They're responding to the changes, adaptation, and listening to, what is river asking them, what are water springs asking them, what is the melting snow and receding glaciers asking them for. And they remain relatively apolitical in many of these discourses. What we have found is an important assertion that we don't want party politics to come in, and that really makes us think and sit up of what kind of politics and governance we have at a larger scale, which is all driven by party politics, at least in the context of India, but we know it's also outside, driven by certain ideologies. Whereas for a lot of these communities, that's not what enables effective governance to happen. And so those governance models are relatively, in a sense, acting neutral, and that's what is very important for people. Now, I want to share some of the at least one such example from a relatively non-rural area, because often this question comes up, okay, this can happen in indigenous territories, but what about cities? And one such example that I want to share is from the western side of India. It is a very interesting landscape because, again, this is this is a region which was under the sea and then emerged out, and where people actually, lots of civil society groups started this process called Homes in the City, where in the assertion of sustainable city was more so to involve a lot of different sort of actors, but really working towards the self governance of city and city planning, and ensuring that the recommoning of spaces, providing livelihoods for the poor, imagining city from the perspective of the most marginal people, like, the city pastoralist or sex workers, or women in general are never involved in urban planning. So how do we bring in the visions of of women into the urban planning, in sense feminizing the urban planning? And also it's a very it's a region that receives very less rainfall. So also thinking about how do we create self-reliance on water and other such things. Again, this is a very large area. Um, and what they've been trying to think about is look at the city from not the perspective of how we usually look at cities, which is, there are urban spaces and then there are rural spaces, and rural and urban are disconnected, but actually think of it as in a bioregional space, wherein the urban and rural dichotomy is actually broken down and they come together. And so enabling planning and spaces of conversations and possibility of planning together. We realize through a lot of this work through governance, but also so many of our colleagues are working on different aspects, that we need to think about it from a collective perspective. Bioregions is, of course, as articulated, is a Western concept, but that sense of what a region or a territory could look like has always been there. So, of course, we use bioregions, and we need to redefine how we use bioregions as well. And that's why I was sharing some of the examples from here in India. But so we formed this group for us to work towards what does bioregionalism really mean for communities, what it has been, and can we bring those collective visions together and reconceptualize political boundaries. And some of the fascinating work that we have that some of the report that you see here, uncovering pre district bioregions of India, was this one first attempt to find out how such kind of conception actually existed before British came here, wherein the territories were divided based on the uniqueness of that landscape. Now, in the northern part of India, there's a state called Uttarakhand, which is divided into two regions, and which is Kumaon and Garhwal. And I don't have the map, otherwise I've shown it to you. But if you ask people how is Kumaon region, they would say, oh, the mountains there are a little, softer, it's more green, and Garhwal is much harsher to live. And that's a very different sense of conception of what a territory could look like. There's a identity to a territory. There are certain attributes associated to a territory. And so we wanted to uncover, and it's not just in North India, it's of course across the country. And so we wanted to uncover some of those articulations of pre-district bioregions of India. And so this report had this kind of work, but there are several other such reports where we have been trying to uncover what if decision making was based on how mountains, rivers, cultures associated would actually be heard and responded to while we are thinking about governance. But I think it is important to also reflect on how does all of this build political power, because that's where the struggle is. And what we've been thinking about is, and what has been emerging, especially from the work of a lot of these communities and our collective work on governance, is that achieving human well-being through citizens and communities to participate in decision making. So of course communities have these systems of governance for so many years, but they need to be acknowledged and recognized by the modern state, in a sense that the way, at least there are some provisions in the Indian constitution where such acknowledgement is possible, but increasingly we are seeing that that sort of acknowledgement is not coming and doesn't want to come, because it really empowers communities to decide what happens in their territories. So Dongriya Kond in the eastern Odisha can say that we follow the law of the mountain, and that the corporations and the state can't come in and mine my forest. But that sort of empowering of communities is increasingly being threatened by powerful states and corporations, because a lot of these systems are actually, if we look at these communities, are ensuring a socio-economic equity and justice, which is going to create a threat for the dominant systems of both economic and political power. and they respect the limits of the earth and also the human limits of how much can we exploit. And in many sense, community in these examples is the basic unit of organization. And as I was saying, that community is not just limited to humans, it includes the more than human. But the destruction, the kind of destruction, at least we are seeing in the Indian South Asian context, is enormous. We are hearing, we know so many territories are being exploited, and despite the existence of these worldviews and these practices, they are massively threatened. The Dongria Code example that I was sharing, the community is going through excessive state repression. They have not been able to recover from that resistance since the time they started, because of the kind of surveillance that the state has had there. So in a sense, a lot of these processes are happening but also excessively threatened. And that's where I want to bring in the issues of the larger crisis that we are living in. So one that also Michelle was talking about when she was giving the introduction of her work, that a lot of these discourses are marred by the kind of colonial legacy that we have had in these regions, where the logic of how we look at the rest of nature was from a property and a resource oriented mindset. That logic continued even after independence in India as well. So most of the administration, most of the decision makers continue with the same logic of looking at rest of nature as a resource. In the Forest Rights Act here in India, that change subsequently happened. But the initial stages, when the British drafted the forest, there was one definition of forest, which was about, like, where the land which has dense tree cover. And the second definition that they had was something that can be used by the state. So that tells us about how the colonial legacy kind of, came into the whole discourse of administration even after the British left India. The second is the regulatory failure, that we, India, did work towards having more decentralization, empowering local village assemblies to take decisions. But in a sense, we are actually going towards more centralized form of decision making, where there's lack of any real democracy, where communities don't really have the right. And importantly, many of these traditional systems of governance have never been recognized in the larger framework of the constitution. There's third, which is a big crisis that I think is common to most part of the world, is the fetishness to neoliberal growth model and fetishness to development model, which is actually threatening a lot of these bioregions and other governance spaces, because of the kind of um, exploitation and the development that the state and the corporations are coming in, which are challenging these systems of governance. And there's a limit to what judiciary can do, and to bring about changes in the ground. And the fifth is that we in the modern discourse have thought that the conservation models adopted, especially primarily in the West, where you create a protected area and a sanctuary, and that's what conservation is, has been the cause of major problem and impacts to many of these bioregions and territories, because that came with the logic that you remove people from these territories and displace them and put them somewhere else, and you create this pristine ecosystem of people, of nature, where then tourists will come and travelers will come and wildlifers will come and enjoy the territories. That has come with the logic that humans are separate from nature, whereas a lot of these communities, and we have seen through work of so many important networks like the ICCA consortium and others, that people have always protected these landscapes while they have lived there. They have always protected these territories. And we need a different sort of a conservation governance model. And so all these issues become interlinked. And that's where I think much of the rights of nature movement comes in. And some of us who are involved see some potential of the movement to be able to challenge that discourse in some ways and bring in the aspects of territorial rights, bring in the aspects of territorial governance, like the New Zealand case where the territories were recognized as a living entity, not just the river, Wanganui River, but her entire ecosystem. And I think that's what the essential element of rights of nature movement could be, wherein territories and communities are looked at as what people's worldview have been, have looked at as a unit rather than separate. And there are several approaches to rights of nature movement. There have been constitutional, judicial, indigenous approaches, and earth-centered governance is somewhere it's trying to come close to what we can conceptualize as governance itself, rather than being focused on anthropocentrism, going beyond that anthropocentrism and looking at governance from a more than human perspective, and looking at communities and indigenous peoples' worldviews, and also adapting it to the modern discourses, the kind of societies that we are living in. I don't want to get into this too much, but why in Indian context we have been started talking about rights of nature is just to give you a brief overview of some cases that happened since 2017 of recognizing rights of rivers Ganga, Yamuna, and rights of animal kingdom. So there have been some interesting judgments by the court of law. But for us, that's not going to solve our problems. It's important. It's changing the discourse. It's questioning the law. It's questioning our mental frameworks of how we look at rest of nature. But we have to go beyond the rights framework. So I'll start from the point D, which is that rights are important, but rights are not going to solve all our problems. It's a path towards larger transformations that we want to achieve. And that starts with the kind of legal frameworks we have. We change the current frameworks, we challenge the current frameworks, but it needs to bring in these community governance systems, community law, communal law also, and deal with them in a much more robust way than the law has been able to deal with them. So either it eliminates, it shuts its eye towards them, or designate as that as backward, something that communities have to deal with. But how can our legal frameworks become more pluriversal and have these worldviews of looking at rest of nature, following the law of land and mountains and rivers? Can that kind of vision come into the modern systems of governance? The second part would be the political governance itself. The kind of governance that we're seeing across the world is moving to a completely opposite direction to the one that we are discussing here today. And it brings us to the question of why that is happening. That in the times of absolute ecological crisis and emergency, and also the crisis of rights and human rights and other such thing, we are actually moving towards more authoritarian governments than the ones which empowers the communities. And it's saying something about the world in general, and all the countries. I'm sure we are experiencing much more state surveillance, much more repression of activists and people. And so it's bringing us to think about our political governance itself. And the first one, which of course, nothing of this that we are talking about today would work if we are not questioning what kind of development do we want. Many of these communities, the examples that I shared, are articulating a different way of being in this world. They're articulating different way of well-being, different way of good life, and defining that in multiple ways, not just the one that was set for most part of the world, that you must pass through these stages of progress to be really called developed. Not all communities want to do that, and we are not questioning much of that in any of our discourses. Of course, in the alternative world, that is being questioned and communities are questioning that, but in many of our discourses we are not taking that question squarely, that what is well-being or good life for us. Or do we need more cars, or does no does the strengthening of public transport can actually change things? So I'm just giving one example of what that re-envisioning could look like. And so for us, when we're talking about bioregionalism, when we're talking about earthy governance or different forms of governance, it is about talking about a more holistic vision of transformations, and it's questioning of the dominant systems of, the words that I'm sure all of you would know about: capitalism, state domination, patriarchy, racism, casteism, human-centeredness, and the continued colonialism. And I think that's a very important point, even for especially um, for the context of where we are living in global south. I think it's a very important point, because many of our, even the progressive movements, continue to have a sort of a colonial imagination in many ways. That colonial hangover is still there, of what sort of transformations also we are talking about. So this continued colonialism has to be questioned even in these movement spaces. I am moving towards the end of my presentation, and I want to highlight some elements of what an earthy governance could look like. And in many of these examples, we see the autonomy and sovereignty are the essential elements of earthy governance. Self governance is a very important element of earthy governance. And it's not just about self governance, but it is also about determination. And I think it is important to highlight that part, is because one is that we govern ourselves, but it's also about determining and questioning the hegemony of nation states, which is what a lot of communities assert when they're talking about self determination. um, these are not just territories, they're actually alive, and so in some ways they're lifescapes, and they're part of a cosmic order. um, I'll give one example of why I'm saying this, based on what I heard from an elder in this trans-Himalayan landscape, the background picture that you see here. So I was asking him, why do you think climate change is happening? Why are glaciers receding, and snowfall is so less these days? Why do you think this is happening? And he said that we have dug up all our sources, and we have dug up the spring water. We are digging up our farmlands, and all of these places have spirits. Spirits reside there, and if we are destroying their homes, how are humans supposed to be happy? Of course, glaciers will recede. Of course, we will face catastrophes, the ones that we are facing. And to me, that kind of articulation of what climate change is never part of any IPCC reports and discourses. But for me, that is so important in defining what climate change is, but also what it is to live in territories. That it's not just about what use we have for this land or for these water sources, but that we are disturbing homes and lands of other beings that we might not be able to see, but they do exist. And as I was saying earlier, the fifth element that we see of the earthy governance is, of course, place-based listening to rivers, mountain, glaciers, and more essentially challenging this way of atomized individual selves, and questioning the separation of humans from rest of nature, but rather seeing communities as an essential unit, and also a larger sense of community. And I I often struggle with the seventh one, which is the consensus-based decision making, because in a lot of communities that is being practiced, but it involves a lot of different sort of a discourse and imagination when we are thinking about other spaces and other communities, especially the modern ones that we are living in. So, how do we articulate earthy governance? And for me, articulation of that earthy governance would be where decision making is from the smallest unit, where all humans have the right and capacity and opportunity to take part, where communities constitute the more than human as well, where the larger units of governance don't have representatives but delegates. So, right now, what we have in our parliamentary or representative form of democracy is that they are representatives who will speak for the people. But in a lot of these systems of governance, we see that there are delegates. So a village headman or the executive committee of a village are not the decision makers, and they're not going to represent the voice of the people. They are the delegates who have been given this responsibility to go and interact with the outside world, but they are actually downward accountable and not to any other unit. So I think that's a very important lesson about what that role of representatives, leaders, politicians looks like. And it's not that, decision making is not about one person one vote, which is what modern democracies have come to be about, but rather it is consensual, respectful, supportive of needs and rights of the marginalized. It brings in more people. Like the first example that I shared from Central India, it was about also re-questioning our own systems, that we are asking for justice from the outside world. Okay, stop the mining, but then within internally our systems, only men are or certain castes are have the decision to decide what happens. And so we need to question that, we need to rework on that. So it's also highlighting that there is a transition in all these systems, realizing the internal issues as well. So how can our systems become robust like that? And so we need to talk about radical politics and economics, and that's why I use the word radical in our in the second slide, because it's all again not disconnected. When we are talking about, we can say direct democracy, we can say earthy governance, or whatever we would like to articulate it as. When we're talking about this sense of governance, we are also talking about a different sort of an economy. And that's why I think Michelle and I, we have been so connected in our work, because that resonates strongly, that these things are not separate. When we're talking about bioregionalism, economy has to be imagined in a very different way. It cannot be the same sort of an extractive economy. It has to be a different sort of social justice and different sort of caste, class, uh, race relationships as well. And so, looking through this flower of transformation that has emerged from a process in India called the Vikalp Sangam, wherein we see, if you see this sphere of life, and this is like broadly 5 spheres that we can look life through, but it's not limited to it. It's just a way of imagining things for this network. That if we look at life, say start with political direct delegated democracy, where in bioregionalism comes in, it talks about plurality and diversity. So cultural diversity and knowledge democracy becomes part of the articulation of what kind of political democracy we want. Economic democracy, as I was saying earlier, the kind of economy of extraction we have right now will not be aligned to the kind of direct bioregional governance we are talking about. So it needs a different sort of economy of share and care, where we are looking at local reliance of basic needs, production, where we are looking at a more comprehensive thinking about what a well-being for a society looks like. And when we talk about well-being, it is also about certain communities in the society who have been relegated to margins. So how do we bring those rights and opportunities for those communities and capacity for them to be part of decision making? So social well-being and justice becomes essentially part of it. Now, I would say, but the most essential part of all of this is the center, which is the values. um, and why is that? Because you are sitting in Australia and in different parts of the world. I'm here sitting in India, and there's so many differences between us. But so either we, because of our differences, don't talk to each other, or rather celebrate that diversity, celebrate those differences, celebrate those cultural, ecological uniquenesses, but also see that there are commonalities between us. For example, um, in all so many ways, we are thinking about how we can strengthen communities, how we strengthen ourselves to respond to the crisis we are facing today. So in terms of crisis, we are all united of the kind that we are facing today. And the way we articulate our alternatives could be so many. They would be diverse, they would be plural, but they are connected through some of these values of self-reliance, self-governance, cooperation, conviviality. Rights of nature is one part of it, reciprocity, interconnectedness. And I think the values become really essential part of much of our struggles and much of our work. And several of these communities, even the ones that I shared, have very different contextual, ecological realities. But that's the kind of assertions that they come together and bring to the table, that brings them also or connects their struggles together. I want to share this map because we can discuss about why it's upside down, but just to highlight that there are so many examples such as these across the world. where communities are asserting that, like the Buen Vivir and Samakwase example from Latin America is essentially that kind of reconceptualization of what well-being could look like, that has informed partly the rights of nature movement there. And the Kurdish movement that is emerging in Central Asia, again thinking about through bioregional and ecological examples, responding to crisis of state domination in an extremely war-torn region of the world. We have this fascinating example also from Bangladesh of Naya Krishi, which is basically new agriculture movement, talking about bringing together communities who are working in a similar small scale farming landscape together. So there are several examples across the world, some traditional, some modern, some hybrid, which are trying to think about what governance could look like from various perspectives, but having certain common principles and grounds of bringing those together, and also creating those connections. So the network that I'm global network that I'm part of is trying to create these solidarity networks between these different movements, but in a sense talking about more interconnected and intersectional changes and transformations that we are wanting to achieve. This is my last slide, and then I'll hand it over to Michelle. Maybe I've gone beyond time, but just to highlight that what are our horizons for a crisis engulfed world. And I think for a lot of us, it is about finding our sense of place, rootedness, and radical attention. I love the way Michelle started, and it's about that sense of connection to the land where we are sitting and what it has been through and what it is going through, that we need to be more mindful and paying attention to. And how can that attention and mindfulness can become entangled with our sense of empathy and responsibility towards that land and those peoples. And it's not just about that sense of empathy and responsibility that we sign a petition, that's important, but also really standing up in a radical solidarity ways of movements of autonomy and democracy across the world. And there's so many who are struggling really to assert that sense of autonomy. And that's where I think the storytelling plays a very important role. Just telling these stories of struggle, these stories of recreation, these stories of regeneration that have been happening across the world, that so many of you, I'm sure, are involved in. Telling more such stories becomes the part of the decolonizing project that I'm sure all of us are interested in, and celebrating the diverse ways that we understand and live in this world. Thank you so much for having listening to me and having that patient ear, and inviting me here. Thank you, Michelle. Over to you now.
Thank you so much, Shrishtee. I always love hearing your talks and updates from projects. It's very inspiring for someone who's been involved in the Earth-centered world for a while. I'm always surprised at how our work resonates, although we're in very different contexts, give or take a British Empire invasion. We have a couple of great questions, but what I'd like to do is have about 10 minutes for you and I to have a bit of a chat. I've got some questions that I'd like to draw out a few more examples, and I thought we might start with and forgive my pronunciation, with the Lachong examples you were giving about the river not being allowed to be dammed. And I'd like to come back to that. But before we do that, put Australia and India within our colonial context and then ask you some questions, if that's okay. So my understanding, Shrishtee, is that the British, through initially the British East India Empire, British East India Company, and then the empire itself, had a dominant role in Indian government, particularly from 1757 to the mid 1860s, but didn't actually leave formally until 1947 or thereabouts, right? So likewise, Australia was invaded by the British Empire in 1788, didn't leave. And what we've got today in Australia is a particular legal system. And for those who know me, know that I give a lot of workshops and courses helping people understand how first laws and Indigenous peoples' legal systems were ancient when British people came and continue in many, many ways in many places. And in a moment, I'm going to bring up some maps just to contextualize all this, because I've got some really burning questions to you as a fellow person working in a space trying to either deeply respect or reinvigorate what we would call first laws. So bear with me, folks. It's a long-winded way of getting to what I want to ask. What I'd like to do in a moment is ask you some questions about how it is that these places, and we'll look at the map so I don't confuse the pronunciation, have been able to maintain any level of self-governance in light of what the British Empire did to the legal system in India. But just before I do that, I just want to remind everyone, and I had these ready to go, in the Australian context. So just 3 minutes, bear with me, and a lot of you who know me have seen these slides, but if we think of modern Australia as a legal system where in 1788 the British came to this place, claimed it, stole land, carved it up with big straight lines, creating our jurisdictions. But all the while, First Peoples had first laws and really ancient land-based laws. And as Mary Graham, Indigenous elder, would say, multiple dreaming stories in multiple places. So a respect for diversity, pluralism, but all based on the relationist ethos. And interestingly, sidestep, Australia, Western science determines that bioregions and subregions in Australia look like this. And most people agree that both the sub-regional and bioregional science assessment of the continent looks a lot more like Aboriginal governance than it does modern Australian governance. So with a Western eye, if I was to say, and Mary Graham and other Indigenous friends agree, that Aboriginal people had a very deep, ancient, complex bioregional system of law. But what we face today, Shrishtee, and this is what I'd love to explore with you just a little bit before we move to other folks' questions. When we talk in Australia about, for example, Mary Graham is working with community folks down at the Gold Coast on her country, looking at how custodial ethics and how respect for ancient law can be not just understood by non-Indigenous people, but actually put into practice. We're dealing with almost like a concretization. The concrete of Western law says that's not real, that's not relevant. And in fact, if you want to even enter into a bioregional or nature-based way of looking at law, you're going to start to really come up against what Western law thinks it is, right? Now, if I go to another map, oops, this one, am I right in saying you mentioned a place I'd never heard of? So Lachung, is that right? Yeah, here? So can you
Yes.
tell us the story of, so in Australia, Western law up until, and Aussies will get this, but up until the Mabo decision, there was zero recognition that Australia had any pre-existing people, let alone a legal system, right? So since the 1990s, Aboriginal people, First Peoples have been battling through a really flawed system, trying to get recognition of what is called in this country native type. But in the meantime, people are caring for country and doing on-the-ground projects that are really deeply important anyway. So talk us through, how is it that places here are literally able to make laws, you said, not preventing dams from being put on a river? I mean, how did those legal systems, number one, survive the British? And how are they continuing today? How does that work inside the legal system? Could you share a little bit with us? I am fascinated.
Thanks for asking, Michelle. Um, so I one that they survived the British was because they were British never reached there. Many of these areas were so far off, like
Yep.
this region, even now, like in the heavy monsoons region, they get cut off from the rest of India because, it just gets cut off. There are landslides and they're just cut off. Even after independence in 1947, this area did not come under Indian territory until 1968, when the king of the region decided finally, after certain settlements and autonomy rights being ensured, that they decided that they will become part of India. Now I'll tell you why they became part of India, and what within the Indian constitution certain powerful provisions were enacted to enable that to happen. Which is that when the drafting of the constitution was happening, and some of the important people involved in the drafting of the constitution B.R. Ambedkar, along with the others who were looking at constitutions of the other parts of the world, actually went to especially this region of the country, which is the Northeast India. And they saw that many communities have sophisticated systems of governance. So it's not just, actually, I've given example of just this
Yeah.
one area, but across, if you zoom out, that
Yep.
whole landscape of the Northeast India, all communities have very sophisticated systems of self-governance, and there are so many tribes in this landscape. So yeah,
Yes.
the whole that area from, Meghalaya, and adjoining Bhutan and other such areas. So whole of that area has extremely
Mhm.
sophisticated systems of self-governance across. And so the people who are drafting the constitution realize that people know how to govern themselves. And what we need to ensure is that we as Indian state don't interfere too much and accord powerful protection within the constitution so that they can follow their systems of governance and interact with the Indian state in ways that they feel more comfortable with. And so there's a very powerful provision which is called the sixth schedule in Indian constitution, and also the fifth schedule, which gives this right to the local village assemblies and certain autonomous regions to have their own systems of governance. And those systems are recognized because of their uniqueness and cultural identity. Now, that happened at the time of drafting of the constitution, and there were only very few regions in the country who got that special status, because that
Okay.
means that they can, do that sort of governance. Now,
Yeah.
this region of Lachung has a special provision under Article 371F, which recognizes their traditional village assembly, which is the Zumsa, as
Mm.
part of the as recognized as the self-governing unit that Indian constitution has. Sorry, it might be getting a little confusing for people who are not aware of the Indian context, but just to say that there is a self-governing unit also uh, within provision for which is within the Indian constitution, but it is marred by lot of party politics. So there, all the political parties come in, but that's the unit that ensures that the self-governance happens,
Mm. Mm.
because India is a federal state. But this one says that you can operate in the rules and ways that you want, but we will recognize it as one of those self-governing units. So that's why it has got a uniquely special status, and they can make their own laws. And so is for several actually communities. I think one major reason why that has happened is also because Indian state in many ways was oblivious of several of these existing. So, like the Trans Himalayan landscape doesn't have a very special protection, but administration just doesn't even know about it. Now they're beginning to
Yeah.
know about it, and it's so surprising when we went in and were doing some work there and speak to the administrators. They're like, "Oh, that kind of a system exists in these landscapes, and these are landscapes that have like lots of tourism. It gets a lot of highlight and governance impetus from the central government." So I think in a way it has been a blessing in disguise that the modern state never really did get into knowing about these systems. But if you see in the mainland India, which is, when you come to central India and when you come to the northern India, many of these systems are lost, and they're completely I mean, people don't believe in those systems anymore, and the modern state institutions have taken over. But now, actually, through our work with many of these traditional systems, we are now realizing that maybe they do exist. Even they have skipped our eyes. We think that they
Mm.
don't exist, but maybe they do still exist, and people still practice, but don't necessarily use the words that we are familiar with.
Mm.
And they do have their own ways of deciding, and of course, they interact and negotiate with the modern systems and don't completely adopt them, but they exist. So it has
Mm.
been an interesting discovery even for us. And just one more point I'll add, and then I'll hand it over to you, is that for the movements themselves, which I'm saying for the progressive movements, civil society groups within India, we also have not looked at these systems from that perspective. So because of certain reasons, those are good enough reasons, that in some regions these systems have been very repressive towards say, women, and very repressive towards certain caste. And so our tendency of I think most movements have that tendency that if something is wrong, we just completely ignore it. Some internal elements that are extremely problematic, we completely throw baby out of the bathwater. So I think that that is also something that we are, as movement spaces, realizing that might have not been the best thing to do, which is that don't engage with the systems. Let's understand what's good in them, what's bad needs to be transformed, but what's good in them. But some of the important reports by the government itself, of the National Commission, in about, I think, 2001, which is not so long ago, did an assessment of these systems, said that yes, they have internal issues wherein the democratic rights and certain laws and legislations of Indian constitution, like the fundamental rights of right to life and equality, must come in, but they should operate primarily the way they are doing so. So I think we have certain precedents on that as well. Yeah.
Mm. No, thank you, Shrishtee. And for anyone who was thinking, why have we gotten into this sort of legalese stuff around bioregionalism? What's really interesting is that what Shrishtee is doing is working with communities who have, for some magical reason, been able to protect their bioregional governance system from the British Empire. And some of that's to do with time and space and the capacity of empire to destroy. And in Australia, whilst we have these systems in place within Aboriginal communities and mindsets, the mainstream, which is a space that AELA works between lots of different ways of seeing and knowing and doing, to decolonize ourselves enough to do actual bioregional work in Australia, comes back to your point, Shrishtee. Challenging the growth and the economic mode is one of the starting points, which is really difficult. But that's a whole nother conversation. So I've got some lovely questions here, and I actually want jump to one and then come back to them in order. But Kari has asked a question that links a little bit to what you were just talking about, and I think I know the answer. But she says, Shrishtee, are the movements that you're describing connected to a new wave of bioregioning efforts in the US and Europe? I would think not. But what is your answer? Yeah.
No, yeah, I don't think so. They are, because also I think one reason would be that bioregional language of bioregion is very recent one. The practice is not, but the language is, and also in many ways, as I was saying earlier, that the idea is also to decolonize the concept itself. And so I think we are at that stage and have not been connected to the groups in the US.
Mm, mm. And in fact, I would suggest, with the work I do as a non-Indigenous person in a colonized nation, often what we're doing is giving Western terms to very ancient cultural concepts that have been around really since the emergence of humanity's ability to organize itself in a bioregional way. But thank you, Kari. Great question. And Kari has put in the notes that she's researching bioregionalism in the US. I'd like to say to everybody, if you're involved in anything researchy, practice, anything around bioregionalism, please get in touch, certainly with me, obviously with Shrishtee too, if you wish. But I'm starting to collect awesome human beings and writings and work that others are up to, because I want to build examples for Australians to understand there are other ways to live, work, and play in place. I just want to come back for a moment, run through quickly some shorter questions. Bryn has asked Shrishtee, how does the ultra-nationalism of the Modi government impact on local governance of non-Hindu communities? I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think there are many of these examples that I've shared from non-Hindu communities, like the Trans-Himalayan landscape is Buddhist and also Muslim communities. The Lachung region is primarily indigenous peoples, and they don't really practice any religion, so to say. And I think most communities, barring a few, I think, or few regions, most communities are going to be mixed communities. Barring a few, in a sense, it would include some regions which are dominated by a particular religion, and of course the indigenous peoples territories wouldn't have any dominant religion. So they would be primarily mixed. Now, the ultra right wing emergence has, of course, had massive impacts in the overall governance of the country, because of the kind of authoritarian state that it has come to become. And that's where the struggle of the sixth schedule is also, because in many ways sixth schedule is going to empower a lot of communities which the trans-Himalayan landscape is asking for, that kind of a recognition. But the Indian state is completely ignorant and don't want to acknowledge that, and that is a very recent trend. So the impact has been a lot, and self governance, I wouldn't say that it is only about certain specific communities, because of course the domination, and because they have a very specific ideology, so it's going to impact minorities especially. But in many ways minorities are also huge in the Indian context, which includes the indigenous people and the Adivasis and the Muslims and Christians and such other minorities. And that has been extremely, I mean, the state has been very repressive over the last 10 years. It has been before also. The Dongria
Yep.
Koans, for example, faced massive repression, but they continue to face. So yeah, that's the reality we are living in
Mm.
many
And any
ways.
colonial legacy country has these issues, doesn't it? Like in Australia, it's the same, cracking down on everyone from environmental protesters to Indigenous people arguing for protection of their traditional lands. So thank you, Shrishti. Kelly has a great question. Did she asked this when you were talking about the decision-making processes, I think particularly dominated by men. Did the disenfranchisement and marginalisation of women in India arise as a result of colonisation, or was it prevalent in Indian society prior to that time?
Mm, well, I think during the struggle itself, there were quite a few um, women who were challenging. I mean, during the imperial struggle as well, there were quite a few women activists who were challenging the patriarchal systems. And I would say they were um, writers, they were artists who began challenging these discourses and challenging the domination of men and domination of certain ways of thinking, even in the movement of
Mm.
independence struggle. There were strong critiques of Gandhi himself because of his ways of thinking about issues of, patriarchy, of how he
Mm.
saw the role of women in the movements. And there were strong critiques that came on his writings when he wrote about what role women can play, a very specific role which he thought as a supporter to, men activists. So those critiques and those struggles began happening, I think, during the independence struggle. And in many ways, that led to because in when you're in struggle or in conflict, and that's more broader point, you realize also the fractions within your own society. So the fractions of caste, they were always there, but when it was misused, or the divisions based on religion, when it was misused by the British, you realize those fractions were actually breaking your society rather than bringing together against a struggle. So I guess a lot of movement, people like B.R. Ambedkar, people like Joytribai Phulle, people like Sarojini Naidu, they all began questioning these internal injustices, which was not just related to gender, but also related to caste and other such.
Mm.
Of course, Gandhi was bringing in the question of religion itself. And there were parallelly a lot of movements, because even the Hindu groups and right wing were active then, and we're talking about a different sort of India than what maybe Gandhi was envisioning. So all of that was happening, and when the drafting of the constitution happened, a lot of these things came into the conversations, and that's why such powerful provisions were made within the constitution. I think it's one of the very good documents. Of course, it has its own problems, but it's a fantastic document, because it was able to look at the issues of the Adivasis, I mean, the indigenous peoples in India, and the issues of caste and gender very squarely, and offered those reservations and possibilities.
Mm. The value of having a constitutional conversation in the 40s and 50s as opposed to the 1890s, which is what we have in Australia. But that's another topic for discussion. Thank you, Shrishti. Fascinating. Another question from Supriya. In cases where there are examples of earthy governance being practiced, how do individuals, especially the youth, connect with and prioritise community well-being over individual gains and freedom? What are the motivating factors here? How are the values that nourish earthy governance transmitted? What a fantastic question.
Yeah. Yeah, lovely question, Supriya. Um, so it's always, I mean, there is a very interesting tension between the young and the old. And that tension is also, I think, a very regenerative tension for the communities. I'll give one example from the Trans Himalayan landscape where the young and the old are divided because of the nature of the change that is happening in the landscape. So this is an area which receives a lot of tourism, and especially over the last 2 decades, it has got massive influx of tourists coming in into the region, which offers so many possibilities. And with as tourists, when we go there, you bring in development, you bring in certain notion of what a modern human being looks like. And when you're stuck with traditions and when you are also trying to change, I think that is always a very interesting tension that comes in. And so there the young people want this traditional system to adapt to that tension, in a sense that also having space for young people to become part of decision making, not as the ones who are just part of the circle, but actually having an active role in decision making. Whereas traditionally the systems have only had older people who have lived in that land for about so many years are allowed to be part of decision making. So now they're going through this internal change and too much conversation about whether we should include young people in decision making. And young people for them is people in their 40s, should be part of whether should be part of the circle of executive committee and village heads. um, and that has so much impact, because even when we were doing conversations around governance and doing this study there, young people would always say that, oh well, this is not democratic enough, we don't they don't have young people within this decision making. And while if they stick to the tradition, it is not feasible, because young people don't even know, they have not even farmed or done their pastoral activities enough by the age of 40 to really know the land, to know the changes that are happening, or to really be able to listen to these ecosystems. So there is a resolve? No, not yet, because it's a continuous dialogue to find that resolve. But also because how do we narrate these stories, or how do we tell these stories? And I think that's where the elders are working towards, that we change the narration, we change the discourse of it, that when it becomes not something that you treat as backward and you don't want it anymore, but something that is becoming closely your part of your identity and part of who you are, then then maybe people, even if they don't really at the moment have that space, it becomes something that they closely relate to. But also in some
Mm.
places they've changed that, and they've got young people involved in decision making. There are youth associations being formed, and it's a continuous dialogue and conversations that keeps happening. But I think it's a generational issue which is everywhere. um, but also in a sense that how can the decision making enable the individual rights to exist of whatever people want to do, but a sense of responsibility be the first element of you being part of a community. And in several of these examples we find responsibility as a key element of the or the key requirement for you to be part of the community. So you have to fulfill certain responsibility, only then you have the rights, which is a very different notion of how we look at rights and responsibilities in our context. I hope I
Oh, and
answered.
no, thank you, Shrishtee. And it's a great question because it speaks to the core issue that we grapple with in Australia, which is how can we, whether you're interested in the environmental care and love that we talk about, or social justice and different kinds of governance, it is how do we change, in our case, particularly westernized minds that are very focused on a certain narrow band of values. And
Mm-hmm.
when people say to me, and I've been doing this work for 30 years now, what's the hardest thing in any of the work you do? And I said, it's to actually get a Westerner to think in an earth-centered way, or to believe that systems can be completely different to what they are now. It's still that mindset change. Everyone thinks we're sort of in this frame and that's how it is. Anyway, we're just about out of time. I'm really glad that we covered off all the questions, I believe. Peter Butler made more of a comment than a question, and I think it was when we were talking about the different governance systems, India, Australia, and as he said, India and Australia are Western cultural concepts, yes, the nation states, and previously they were all more regional, and yes, and I said yes.
Yeah.
And again, in some of the talks I give, I show a map of the world or various maps of the world in the 1400s. You know, imagine the world in the 1400s, and it's basically a patchwork quilt of biocultural human existence. There were a few empires that had popped up here and there, but it wasn't the same as it is today, where we have seen this globalization of particularly Western concepts. Um, we're just about to run out of time. What I wanted to do before I do a huge thank you for Shrishtee is extend an invitation to anyone on this call or watching the recordings. If you're interested in bioregionalism and you don't have other friends to play with, please shoot me a note. Shrishtee and I are developing some ways to collaborate more and more over the coming months and years, and I'm excited about that. And shoot us a note at ayla@earthlaws.org.au, and I will be very pleased to find out what you're up to. And if there's any ways we can connect or share or whatever, that would be good. Also want to do a final plug for Ian Lowe's webinar with me, which will be a very different tack. It'll be critiquing Western science and governance and bioregional knowledge, but very important way for Westerners to actually push back at Western ways of thinking, which is modern science. And I also just want to share, I wrote a little chapter in a book, and you can't get it unless you pay an exorbitant amount for the book, but it's actually called Imagining Ecocentric Bioregional Law and Governance in Australia. And it takes a futuristic view on what if we needed so desperately to focus on the importance of a healthy ecosystem, we changed the system to support Indigenous first laws. And I actually want to sneakily put a copy of that onto somewhere where people can access it for free, because it's a conversation starter. If it stimulates you into thinking stuff differently, but in our context, that's grand. And thank you, Sarah Bashforth, my wonderful AELA colleague, has put in the booking link if you want to join the October Bioregionalism seminar. We may actually have one in late August around housing, and how could housing be a bioregional issue? Well, that's exciting and must be discussed. Shrishtee, this has been fantastic. I could talk to you all day, and I hope one day we will meet in person and we can sit and talk all day. But thank you so much for your generosity of time, your intellectual work, and just the spirit and the heart of all the work that you're doing is just really valuable. And everyone's writing wonderful comments. So thank you, Shrishtee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sarah, and everyone for joining today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll turn off now, but please get in touch. Thank you for the lovely comments coming in now. And hopefully we'll be in touch with all of you again very soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.